Hi, this is Sibendu Chakraborty from the Department of English, Chakraborty College. At a very outset, I shall like to thank Professor Dilwar Hussain for inviting me to present a lecture on performance studies, text, and praxis. And I shall like to tell about what performance studies actually is, and what are the factors that go in the making of performance studies as possible, and what kind of a discipline it is, and how performance studies is related to drama and theatre studies. And in course of my talk, I shall like to touch upon some of the textual elements that might be there in your curriculum. So I shall like to start with a few important questions. For example, question number 1: what constitutes a performance? Question number 2: to what extent are performances occurring throughout cultures? Question number 3: is it still a performance if there is no spectators around? Or we can reframe this question in another way: if a performance isn't defined by the purchase of a ticket and entering a theatre space, when and where can it be seen to begin and end? And again, in order to answer these questions, we need to formulate our notions of looking at performance studies, and what are the other areas that we need to touch on. We can define performance, we can look at performance as merely an activity that only takes place behind the proscenium arch. That is our traditional notion, that performance is something that takes place behind an proscenium arch. Or can it be contained within the box set also? That means the box set form or a proscenium arch are two important things that contain theatre, and from this perspective they can be said to define performance from this point of view. The discipline of performance studies has expanded upon this definition, so that we can now see that performance is an inherent part of the customs, the rituals, and the practices of cultures. The theatricality of everyday activities, such as the way clothes are worn or the way dinner is served, now can be analyzed in terms of performance and performance studies. So, to start with a makeshift definition of performance studies, we can say that the word performance can be understood as being related to theatricality, a sense of otherness. There's a sense of otherness because in theatricality, the sense of otherness is the most important condition of non-identical repetition that can occur anywhere and anytime. So this is the non-identical repetition of incidents that can occur anywhere and anytime, and it can be looked upon as our day-to-day activities. And if we take some time out of our daily lives and activities to focus on how we wash our face, we take our bath or take our meal, how we dress ourselves, now these are some of the nitty-gritties, these are some of the things that we need to consider about when we are talking about performance studies. Now, performance may consist of societal rituals, or it may be understood as the conscious and unconscious adaptation of roles that we play during everyday life, depending upon the company we keep or where we are located at that time. That means performance is constituted of ourselves and our immediate environment. Uh, the theatrical metaphor is a fundamental tool we use to understand culture, to alter the balance between the artistic and rhetorical. I repeat, to alter the balance between the artistic and the rhetorical foregrounds in the theatrical experience that displays performance as an integrated part of everyday life, rather than a rarefied event, the periphery that is located at the periphery of communal experience. Then, to define performance, we can attempt to chart that border region, that liminality, that border region where a map with prominent borders becomes a site of mystery. So, performance studies is basically indulging oneself with a notion of studying what vanishes to make its appearance and, what shall I say, its kind of importance in the theatrical and non-theatrical world relevant. That means when an enactment moves away from a zone of no concrete knowledge into that of something that is not concrete, not fixed, but susceptible to fluid interpretations, then perhaps the notion of performance studies arises. Now, the term performance includes a vast range of activities that involve the presentation of rehearsal, that means actions and pre-established patterns of behavior in art, literature, and in everyday social communication. Richard Sechner, one of the one of the most important figure of performance studies, who points out that there are opposing tendencies. I repeat, this is very important. There are opposing tendencies present in all performance, like the tendency to make things happen and to entertain, to be oneself and to play at being others. Again, to be in a state of trance and to be conscious at the same time. So, performance studies straddles between these opposite or contradictory modes of enactment, both physically as well as mentally. But an agency is required in performance studies. In most cases, it is a human being, but sometimes it can also be an inanimate object. And sometimes we can say that the dominant performing agency is the human agency or the actor's body. So sometimes performance studies and theater may sound to be tautological, but this is not the case, because theatre studies is a part of the entire spectrum of performance studies. It is only a section of performance studies as proper. Now, coming to three important figures who define performance studies and sort of developed some kind of links and correspondences with social drama, anthropology. I am going to name three important figures. There are many others, but I shall like to sort of concentrate on three important contributors in this field. One is, of course, Richard Sechner. Another is anthropologist Victor Tanner, and the third is the sociologist Irving Goffman. Now, these three major contributors established connection between performance studies and social sciences, and from their contributions we have started to look performance studies as an inclusive term. Now, we again sort of shall try to look at performance studies as a kind of role-playing activity, since Victor Tanner makes a particular development in performance theory by sort of building up a kind of convergence between anthropology and theatre. Now, Tanner uses theatre or drama as a metaphor for the non-theatrical, the cultural and social manifestation. Tanner develops the concept of social drama. His concept of social drama was based on Arnold van Gep's famous work, The Rites of Passage, in which Van Gep develops a model to analyze the functioning of rituals in the society. How rituals function in a society can be analyzed by means of a model devised by Victor Tanner, and that was based on Van Gep's Van Gep's analysis. Now, the four important stages of this model. The model is made up of four important stages. Number one is separation or breach. Number two is the margin, where the crisis takes place. The third stage is the redressive action, and sometimes it leads to reintegration, or if reintegration is impossible, then it leads to a state of permanent schism. Now, Sechner calls performance studies a restored or twice behaved behavior. Performance being a restored behavior exists as a second nature and is subject to revision and changes. So we can say that a performance is always in a subjunctive mood. In his famous book, Performance Studies and Introduction, Sechner says that performance can be used as an umbrella term to include anything that is framed, presented, highlighted, and displayed. The interpretative potentials of performance are multiple, and this performative aspect makes drama different from the literary genre. A performance can either be text-centric or stage-centric, but the integrity of the play has to be maintained in both the types. Actually, this was a comment by, the famous Indian playwright, Mahesh Dattani. Now, so coming into a kind of analysis of these kind of things, the presence of the three kind of stages in the development of the performance mode in theater, there is one important term called the mise en scène or performance, that is the staging of a play, and with its accompaniment, with the accompaniment of actors, the props, the curtains, the light, the music, and all those things together. Now, performance of a text is not simply the transformation of a text into performance. This is important. According to Patrice Pavis, it is the synchronic confrontation of all signifying systems in a given space and time. Rather, it is an organic ensemble of signs on stage. The signs working within a particular theatrical context occupy signifying power which they lack in their normal day-to-day functions. Thus, in performance, the text is concretized and actualized in a particular social context along with other stage materials. For example, if we look at Mahesh Dattani's plays, for example, Bravely for the Queen or Tara, for example. Now, in Bravely for the Queen, we can find a bonsai is a very potent theatrical metaphor that can be looked upon as a potential sign. Now, being analyzed from a semiotic point of view, the bonsai stands for the grotesque and the stunted growth of individuals in an upwardly mobile urban middle class, where the middle class itself is in a stage of transition, because the individuals are trying to balance between their notions of traditional individual life and the kind of life that they have learned to acquire, or sort of they're struggling to acquire with the changing socio-historical, cultural, political, economic, sexual scenario. Now, the bonsai being a stunted such as plant with a very grotesque appearance symbolizes semiotically the very grotesque growth and development of humanity, because they have failed to stand up in response to the kind of changes that they should have acquired in the changing socio-political, economic conditions of modern and postmodern existence. Now, similarly, if we look at Girish Karnad's Hayavadana, a profoundly symbolic play where the transposition of heads between that of Devadatta and Kapila is a kind of symbolic search where human beings are trying to find perfection through trial and error method. Now, this kind of negotiations in theatres semiotically, with the help of multiple signifying systems that sometimes become confrontational, but ultimately they congeal, they sort of come close to each other, and it becomes a matrix of an envisioned performance studies. The concept of representation always signifies a kind of absence, and the kind of absence that we find in representation can be answered through a semiotic understanding of drama by substituting the absence with the signs and the significations both in the text and in the stages. I shall like to conclude with the notion of performativity. Now, performance studies derives the major sense of performativity from speech act theory. Actually, it was a series of lecture delivered by J.L. Austin in 1955. But only in 1962 it got converted into a book, and the title is How to Do Things with Words. The linguistic philosopher J.L. Austin distinguished between two kinds of utterances. One is called constantives or statements that are general statement, declarative sentences, while another kind of sentences are called performatives. Now, for example, I wish you could have been my best friend. Now, these kind of sentences where some kind of action is implied is the function of language that make things happen. So language is not only something that merely states something, it makes things happen in our lives. So theater can exploit the speech act theory being devised by J.L. Austin, and performativity is an arena where we can look upon the potentialities of speeches that would enable us to study theater, performances, drama, and to some extent play texts also. If we can correlate these play texts with other inflected elements of performance studies, then we can sort of have a notion of the speech act as a very important component of performance studies as proper. Thank you.